Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the FIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's KOMMAREDDI Family Lecture. Tonight, we have Professor Deborah Hutton with us for a presentation on Cosmopolitan Visions, Art and Architecture from the Islamic Courts of Southern India. The KOMMAREDDI Family Lecture Series was established by Jay and Dr. Prasad KOMMAREDDI to focus on topics related to the art, history, and culture of South Asia. Thank you, Jay and Dr. Prasad, for bringing this lecture series to the FIA. And I just have to call out, it's called the KOMMAREDDI Family Lecture. There's a lot of members of the KOMMAREDDI family. Would you just raise your hand and wave at us? Thank you. Yes, thanks for being here. So the next KOMMAREDDI Family Lecture will be in September. The date is to be announced, and it's going to be an exciting one. If you are a member, or if you're not a member, please consider joining this evening. Membership is the most rewarding way to experience the FIA, including discounts on art school classes, ticketed events and films, as well as our museum shop and palette cafe. You will also be mailed our FIA magazine, that beautiful piece right in the middle there, that has all the latest information on upcoming programs, such as the KOMMAREDDI Family Lecture in September. If you are already a member, thank you. Before we bring tonight's guest, Professor Hutton, to the stage, as always, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts, Education, and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry 7 days a week to the FIA for Genesee County citizens. Thank you. I would also like to thank the Ford Foundation Equity Fund of the Community Foundation of Greater Flint for making the ASL interpretation possible. Yes, thank you. Now please take a moment to silence your devices. Deborah Hutton is Professor of Asian and Islamic Art History at the College of New Jersey. In both her teaching and scholarship, she's committed to presenting a globally diverse history of art that centers equity and social justice. She is author of Art of the Court of Bijapur and co-author of Raja Deen Dayal, artist-photographer in 19th century India. Most recently, she has been involved with producing art history textbooks for the 21st century, including The History of Art, A Global View, and The History of Asian Art, A Global View, both published by Thames and Hudson. And those sound like really exciting textbooks I wish I had had when I was in school. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Professor Deborah Hutton.
Hello. Thank you so much, Tracy, for that welcome, and thank you to everyone who has made my trip so smooth and seamless. Sarah and Emily and Lori and Craig, and of course, most of all, a big thank you to Jay and Prasad KOMMAREDDI and the whole family. Thank you so much I'm really thrilled to be here, and thank you all for coming out. Okay, I'm gonna start my timer so that I keep to time. And I'd like to take the liberty of dedicating this lecture to Dr. Catherine Asher, eminent art historian of Mughal India and my beloved PhD advisor who passed away last month at her home in Minneapolis. Kathy, and you're seeing 4 books that she published there, as well as a couple photos of her. Kathy was ahead of her time in understanding the social responsibility we have as art historians to our colleagues and students, but also to the subjects we study, to do top-notch research, to communicate our findings in clear and compelling ways to our audiences, and above all else, to study the people, places, and things that are in danger of being forgotten or ignored because they don't fit into the tidy categories we like to assign to the past. Indeed, Kathy was committed to researching architecture that bridged the sectarian divides, Hindu and Muslim, but also Jain, Buddhist, Christian, and Sikh, through which South Asian culture too often has been divided since the British colonized India, the Indian subcontinent. And for those of you who are not, I actually can't even see the audience now, so I'm not sure where you're all from. So I'm not assuming anything, but for those of you who may not be familiar, the British began colonizing India in the 18th century, and India didn't gain its independence until 1947. The British, during that time, heavily studied India's heritage. That's when the study of Indian art began in the modern sense that we think of it. And they really they categorized things along religious lines, thereby stressing religious differences rather than any cultural continuity. And Kathy understood that how we talked about the past matters, that history and heritage are fundamental to how we see ourselves in the present and what we imagine is possible in the future. And indeed, we can see how important how we talk about the past is in the so-called history wars playing out in both India and the United States at this very moment, and other parts of the world as well. The details of these conflicts vary immensely, but they make the point that history and heritage matter, that art and how we talk about it, whether in museums, classrooms, books, travel shows, matters. The Mughals are at the center of the current debates in India. And it makes sense because the Mughal Empire was such a powerful empire. So the Mughals were Muslims who spoke Persian, who were wealthy and powerful, and ruled a large chunk of the Indian subcontinent for about 300 years. I tell my students all the time that even if they don't think they know the Mughals, they've heard of the Mughals, whether through the Taj Mahal, the supposedly most photographed building in the world, or because they've heard someone use the phrase, oh, he's a mogul of industry or a movie mogul. Of course, mogul coming from Mughal, a term adopted by the British because they were so in awe of the Mughals' power. However, the Mughals were not the only Muslim dynasty in India, nor were they even the first. By the time they came to power, Muslim rulers had been ruling in North India for over 300 years. So to put that into context, longer than the United States has been around. And even when the Mughals were growing their power, they were not the only Islamic dynasties ruling in India. So if you see on this map, to the south of them here, were a number of smaller states. These eventually would be conquered by the Mughals, but for about 200 years, these kingdoms, commonly referred to as Deccan sultanates, so a sultanate is an area ruled by a sultan, just like a kingdom is an area ruled by a king. They produced wonderful, beautiful art, which I'm showing you some examples here. And they were also wealthy and cosmopolitan, and each of these 5 sultanates had its own distinct courtly culture that combined religious, linguistic, and regional traditions in ways that might surprise us today. And so studying these Islamic dynasties, these Deccan sultanates, highlights India's diversity in all sorts of ways. And if there's one thing that I would like you to take from today's lecture, one thing that I can stress is the diversity of India and Indian art. I think that it's vastly underestimated in the United States, even sometimes by people who have spent time in India or come from India, exactly how diverse India is. And it makes sense if you think about how we typically divide up the world geographically, right? We have 7 continents. One of those continents is Asia. India is a country in Asia, so it must be similar to, say, France, a country in the continent of Europe, right? But if you actually talk to geographers, Asia is equivalent to 4 Europes in terms of size, population, biodiversity, cultural diversity, linguistic diversity, etc. So it's actually more apt to think of India like the European Union. So within India is the equivalent of a Sweden, a France, a Greece, within the states that make it up. And I'm showing you that here in this map of the biodiversity of India. And I got it off the internet. I really like it, but I noticed this morning that there's a typo in Myanmar, and it's really bothering me now. But in any case, the area that we're going to focus on is the Deccan Plateau. And this is this rocky plateau that connects the northern and southern parts of the Indian subcontinent. You can see a picture of it here. Notably, it had fertile soil for growing cotton, and it had the world's earliest diamond mines. So in the period that we're going to talk about tonight, 16th, 17th century, it was a very wealthy region. And also because it was bordered on one side by the Eastern Ghats and the Coromandel coast, where it had the perfect combination of water and growing conditions to dye beautiful cotton fabric that was exported all over the world. And on the other side, by the Western Ghats and Goa, which were important maritime ports. So together, all of these things made this region home to a diverse group of people, merchants and noblemen who were looking for their fortunes. Adding to that geographic diversity, the other interesting thing about the Deccan is it's what linguists call a linguistic splinter zone. And that's because it's a place where three languages come together. Oops. So you can see here. So it's Marathi, Telugu, and Kannada are all spoken in different parts of the Deccan. And I put over here, if you're interested, each of them written in their own scripts. So you can see that we're not just talking about different languages like French and German, we're talking about languages that use completely different script systems, all coming together on the Deccan Plateau. And during the 16th and 17th centuries, Persian or Farsi and Dakhni were also widely spoken throughout the Deccan. Then on top of this linguistic diversity, we have, of course, these political states. So we have these 5 sultanates, Ahmednagar, Berar, Bidar, Bijapur, and Golconda. And they operated sort of like siblings. They would squabble and fight each other over boundaries, and then alternately come together to band up to fight their adversaries together. Of the 5, Bijapur and Golconda were the most powerful and longest lasting. And so what I thought I would do for the rest of my lecture is, because I want to highlight these themes of cosmopolitanism, mobility, and diversity in the Deccan in the 16th and 17th centuries. So again, just to kind of situate you, historically, we're talking about the same period as the Renaissance. So if you go out and you go through the wonderful Renaissance galleries here, this is the same time period that we're talking about. So I thought we would focus on Bijapur, which was ruled by the Adil Shahi dynasty from their capital of the same name, Bijapur, so sort of like New York, New York. And I'm showing you a couple of views of it here. And I thought what I would do is I would focus on 5 people, 5 figures who lived in Bijapur in the 16th and 17th century, and the art associated with them as a way of highlighting these themes. Oops. The first one that I would like to focus on is Ibrahim Adil Shah II, who is the 6th ruler of Bijapur. He was, and you can see, can you all read the dates and all those kinds of things? It's not an art history class, so there'll be no tests later on about the dates, but some of you might want to know. So he was a Sunni Muslim, but he was quite eclectic religiously. And it was his tomb that was on the posters for the talk, and this is a portrait of him. And I should say that if you're not familiar with Indian painting from this period, most of what I'm showing you tonight, almost all of them, are very small works on paper. They're commonly called miniature paintings, and they're literally smaller than a piece of paper. And you really have to use magnifying glasses to see all the details, and they were made with pigments that were often, so that background in the gold there is actual gold. If you saw it in person, it would sparkle like gold. And so the preciousness of the pigments was part of the appeal of these paintings, and they are meant to be looked at for a very long time. All right, so Ibrahim was a Sunni Muslim, but he was religiously eclectic. He was a follower of Sufism, Islamic mysticism. He was also a musician. He was said to fall into his trance when he listened to music, and here you see a portrait of him playing music, and wearing the dried, buried beads of a Hindu mystic. He wrote poetry. This is a cover of a book of poems he wrote called the Kitab-i-Nuras. And in those poems, he gave himself the Sanskrit title Jagat Guru, world teacher, and mused that his parents were the Hindu god Ganesh and the goddess Saraswati. So Saraswati is the goddess of learning and music. And so you can see in this amazing painting in the middle here, and I'm going to show you a couple more views of it, that was made in Bijapur, shows the goddess Saraswati playing a veena as she sits on this beautiful golden throne. Can you all see her here? And then below her is the peacock, which is her animal vehicle mount that shows it's her in this fountain. There's an attendant. There are these beautiful oversized Chinese blue and whiteware vases, porcelain vases. And then you have here these two angels that are depicted in a Persian style, Iranian style of angel, with their wings, each one a wing pointing up to this picture, and here I have a detail of that picture, which is of Ibrahim himself riding on his favorite elephant, Atash. And here we have another painting from Bijapur around the same time that again is showing Ibrahim on his elephant, so you can see that that's what this detail is showing. So this is a really remarkable image, right? This is a Muslim sultan, his portrait behind this image of a Hindu goddess. And what's really extraordinary about it is that it wasn't extraordinary, right? And it wasn't just Ibrahim that embraced this eclecticism. So for example, the whole royal court was obsessed with this term Nuras. Nuras is a poetic term, and you can translate it from Persian to mean as no rasa, 9 rasas, or 9 flavors, or you can translate it as nuruz. In local Dakhani, they were kind of pronounced the same, but the poetry makes it clear that they loved this. They wanted this illusion. And Nowruz means new day or new fashion. So you could interpret it as 9 flavors or new fashions, and it probably was associated with the Persian holiday of Nowruz, the New Year, but also with the Sanskrit tradition of the 9 rasas, which are these 9 emotions or aesthetic qualities that good art should have. So here we have this Indic and Persian coming together. And a scholar named Nazir Ahmad has found 17 different items that were named Nowruz at the court. So these included the Kitab-i-Nuras, the book of poems that Ibrahim wrote, a musical note. There was a sweet wine with 9 flavors. That was the Nowruz wine, the royal flag, and an entire city that was founded in 1599 called Noraspur. And the center of this new city was the royal palace called the Noras Mahal, and it was surrounded by a 9-sided wall, and you're seeing it here, 9-sided wall with 9 arches cut in there, just in case you didn't get the metaphor, right? The 9. Now, sadly, Noraspur was destroyed in 1624 by a neighboring army. They never finished building the walls. They went right into the partying part. They should have finished the walls first. So it lays in ruins today, but it gives us enough to get an idea of what the city was like, and it was also talked about in historical texts. It was just 4 miles from Bijapur, and with another suburb called Shahpur, it formed this kind of larger metropolitan area. And one Flemish merchant described it as the size of Cairo, all of this together in the 16th century and early 17th century. And Shahpur was the center for trade. That's where merchants stayed. Bijapur stayed the kind of official capital. That's where if you were ambassador, you stayed. And Noraspur became this place to enact sort of the culture of Noras. They would, so for example, there was a new holiday that they created called Idi Noras that was celebrated whenever a Friday fell onto the 9th day of a month. And they would celebrate it by having day-long performances of storytellers and musicians at the Noras Mahal. So, because of this emphasis on Noras, new flavors, the other thing that I did was that there was this culture of artistic innovation that happened during his reign. And you can see that of experimentation. And not all of them came out wonderfully, but so there's, I've spent a lot of time looking at Bijapuri art. There's some failed paintings. I sort of liked the failed paintings, but they're experimenting. They're trying out new things, and you can see this experimentation just by looking at portraits of Ibrahim. So what I'm showing you here are 9, and yes, that was on purpose, 9 portraits of Ibrahim. And you can see him in so many different ways. You see him on his elephant, playing music, with a beautiful woman, with his courtiers, with a Sufi saint, riding on horseback. But you notice how different they all are from each other. Stylistically, I mean, this close-up of his face is incredibly unusual for this time in Indian painting. But you can see them playing with composition, with perspective or not, and even how Ibrahim looks varies from painting to painting. When art historians were first studying these paintings, they assumed his facial hair indicated his age. So they used it as a way to try to date the paintings, and they said, oh, when he's smooth-faced, that must be earlier. Then now he's got a little bit of a beard, must be a little bit older, and oh, this must be later. But in fact, it doesn't work. So it's really about, these are almost poetic type portraits of him, and whether he was smooth-faced is whether he was being portrayed in this Persian ideal of the young prince hawking on horseback, or if he was being portrayed in a different type of ideal. And so even his appearance kind of fit this poetic culture that was happening at the time. Now, 3 of these, this one, and this one, are all made by the same artist named Farooq Hussein. He's also called Farooq Beg. And he is my second person that I want to talk about. So Farooq Beg, and you're seeing a self-portrait of him that was done towards the end of his life, was a Persian artist. He was born in Iran. By 1580, he was working in Kabul, in what is today Afghanistan, so here on the map. He then quickly gets recruited to work at the imperial Mughal courts in Delhi and Lahore. And this is a work that was done by him for that Mughal Emperor Akbar around 1590-95. But shortly after that was made, he moved south for reasons that we're not sure about, and went to Bijapur and worked for Ibrahim for about a decade, and then goes back to the Mughal court and spends the rest of his life there. This work that he did was made within just a year or two of the one I just showed you. And this is the one of Ibrahim hawking, and it's a really exquisitely beautiful painting. If you see it in person, all of the greens and the golden sky. Now, it's signed Farooq Hussein, but for a very long time, art historians did not believe it was the same artist as the Farooq Beg at the Mughal court, because if you compare them, they look like they're in completely different styles. And it made just within a year or two of each other. So I think you can see that even if you're new to looking at Indian painting, the compositions are completely different, right? If you look up close, the way the figures are depicted is completely different. And art historians said, one artist, how can they make that change in just a short period of time? Even the backgrounds, the colors, right? The colors that are used are very, very different. And the other paintings that are either signed or attributed to Farooq Hussein from Bijapur are the most Bijapuri of the Bijapur paintings. They all have this characteristic palette of this light acid green with the dark green, the orange, the pink, and the heavy use of gold. Do you see that in all of these? This is if you go to a museum and you see that, you know the paintings from Bijapur. And they also just, they're experimenting, right? But the thing is, an artist doesn't have one style that they can work in. An artist can change a talented artist can change their style. And Farooq Hussein, as he was known in the Deccan, or Farooq Beg, as he was known in the Mughal court, was prized in both as the master artist. He's written up in both in the court histories. The dates line up. It is clear it is the same person. It just made art historians rethink what they thought about how artists worked and how quickly they could shift their style to please their patrons, and that their mobility changed their style. And we see that because when Farooq Beg goes back to the Mughal court, he keeps a couple elements of Deccan art in his painting. Notice, I should have quizzed you and see how many of you could pick this up, but do you notice the flowers on either side of him? And they're exactly the same pink flowers that come from Bijapur, and so he kept that. And he really was a skilled artist, and we have to remember the mobility, not just of people, but of images, because one of the last images he made at the Mughal court is this beautiful painting of a Sufi saint that's based on a European print that was circulating in the Mughal court. And he has taken that print and he has combined it with Mughal style, but also Deccan style. Look at this use of our orange here, right? This beautiful kind of psychedelic tree, and put it all together to create his own style. Now, Farooq Beg was not the only mobile artist. The next artist I want to talk about is actually from the Netherlands, a Dutch artist named Cornelius Clauza Heda that also ended up in Bijapur in 1610, just a few years after Farooq Beg left. Unlike Farooq Beg, though, we don't actually have any paintings by Heda that survive. But what we do have are letters he wrote himself from Bijapur from 1610 to 1622. And I'm showing you one of these here. And from these, we know that he was born in Haarlem, that he trained with Cornelius van Haarlem, and you're seeing a work by him. So this is a work by his teacher. So we know that he painted in what's called the Dutch Mannerist style. That's lots of nudes and elongated forms with kind of exaggerated proportions, right? Now, this was a style that was starting to fall out of favor in the late 16th, early 17th century. So we don't know why Cornelius Clauza Heda left Haarlem, but he did. Sometime around 1600, he leaves Haarlem and he goes to Prague to try to get an appointment as a court artist to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. And he writes all of this in his letters. It's an amazing series of letters. My husband keeps telling me to give up the art history thing and write a historical novel about Heda. But my writing skills, historical fiction writing skills are not that strong. So if any of you would like to take it up, I'm offering it out there as a topic. So he leaves Haarlem and he goes to Prague to try to get an appointment as a court artist with the Holy Roman Emperor. But it doesn't work. We don't know why, he doesn't say, but he doesn't appear in any of the documents there. However, while he's there, and remember, this is the early modern period, what historians call the early modern period. This is when we're getting global sea routes and people moving around. The Safavid Iranian Emperor Shah Abbas sends an embassy to Rudolph II because they have a mutual enemy, the Ottoman Empire, and they want to try to get trade negotiations going. And one of the ambassadors offers Cornelius Clauza Heda a job as a court artist to Shah Abbas. Says, oh, we would love to have a Dutch artist come. So he accepts, and they try to get to Iran, but everything goes wrong. They try to go through Russia, but Russia's at war, so they have to go back up to Sweden. They get caught in a storm, so they have to hang out in Sweden for a while. They make their way back to the Netherlands. They're trying to figure out how are they going to get to Iran. They finally get to Spain, Portugal, and they get a ride on a boat that's taking the new Portuguese viceroy to Goa. So they have to go all the way around, right, because this is before the Suez Canal. And they winter down here in Portuguese Mozambique. And the idea was that they were going to drop off Haida and the Persian ambassadors in here, and they would go to Isfahan, and then the boat would go on to Goa. But while they were wintering, the viceroy, the Portuguese viceroy, comes to suspect Cornelius Clauza Haida of being a spy for the Dutch, because the Dutch and the Spanish are at war. And they throw him in a trunk, they imprison him, and they take him all the way to Goa, and they throw him in prison in Goa. However, once he's there, a merchant, a jewel merchant, vouches for him and says, no, he's not a spy, and rehabilitates Haida to the point that the viceroy says, oh, actually, well, do you want to work for me as an artist? But at that point, he wants nothing to do with the Portuguese. So he goes inward. It's like a 8-day journey to Bijapur, because he's heard from all these jewel merchants of how wealthy Bijapur is. And he writes, and I'm actually going to read a translation from his letter, what happens when he gets to Bijapur. So he says, the king, meaning Ibrahim Adil Shah II, the king, as a great lover of our art, had already heard the news that I had come, and let me, since I had arrived by horse, immediately come before him. Asked what sort of man I was, I gave him a description of all that had occurred. The king said that he had long wished for a painter from our land. He had me clothed with great honor following the custom of the land. This is giving him a coat to wear. The king commended me to make something. The king's highest counselor and secretary took me with him to his palace. I did my best so that I had in 15 days a small piece of Bacchus, Venus, and Cupid, which the king approved and held for 2 hours before his face, meanwhile speaking with me and asking me if I wanted to serve him for a time, promising to give me great riches. I swore him service, he showed me great honor, and further gave me a robe with a purse of 500 pagodas of money, ordered me to make another work, and in this work a great fever surprised me, and now, with God's help, is going even better. The king also shows great concern for my health. So finally, he got his court appointment. Now, he says he painted this work of Venus, Bacchus, and Cupid. Again, no works by Haida survive, but that was a very common theme in Dutch Mannerist works. So I can show you what it probably looked like, right? Notably, he writes this letter from Noraspor. So that's where he's housed, right? So this exotic Dutch artist making this artwork that must have been very exotic for Ibrahim and his court is hanging out in Noraspor, in this place of new flavors, new fashions. Haida stays in Bijapur for the rest of his life. He doesn't seem, we have more letters by him, he doesn't seem to actually have ended up painting all that much. He acted more as a sort of diplomat and someone who helps negotiate trade deals, which is in fact how court artists in Europe also acted at the time. And what's fascinating about this, well, first of all, this is before a European artist ends up in Iran or in the Mughal court. So it's in Bijapur first. But second, we do have some later works in Bijapur that seem to suggest they were inspired by Mannerist painting. In particular, do you see sort of how their lower bodies are elongated? Do you see that? And that comes from Mannerist painting. And this is a mural in a building in Bijapur that for a long time people thought was painted by European artists, but I don't think it was. But I do think it shows some of Haida's later influence. But what's really striking about this, for me, is that it shows how much Bijapur was part of this larger early modern world. That an artist from Haarlem in the Netherlands can go to Bijapur and know how he's expected to act as a court artist, and it can be successful at that. And he knows, I mean, he's kind of selling himself as this exotic commodity, right, for this time. And it works because Bijapur is because the Deccan is so wealthy and such a draw for people from all over. Now, it wasn't just artists that were mobile. Nobles, historians, poets also moved from North India, from Iran, and from other parts of the world. One of the notable features about the Deccan during this period are the large number of East Africans who lived there and who rose to high positions, particularly in the military. And so the fourth figure that I would like to talk about is a man named Ikhlas Khan. Actually, his birth name was Malik Rehan. Ikhlas Khan was a title that was given to him later on. And he becomes eventually prime minister to Ibrahim Adil Shah II's son, the next ruler of Bijapur. He was what's called a Habshi. And this is an enslaved soldier that was born on the Horn of Africa. And so I'm showing you here. So from the modern nations of Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea. So within Islamic kingdoms at this time, there was the practice of slavery. But it's slightly different than how we imagine slavery. It's different than the transatlantic or chattel slavery, in that, so in the Muslim world at this time, you could only be enslaved if you were born non-Muslim. So slaves tended to come from Africa, from Central Asia, or Eastern Europe, and they would be taken from their families as very young children. They would be converted to Islam, and then they would be educated. And particularly for men, it was seen that they were actually educated alongside the ruler's children oftentimes, and the idea was that they wouldn't have loyalty to their family or their tribe or their village. Their loyalty would be to the rulers. They often formed the elite troops that surrounded the rulers. And they could own property. Their children would not be enslaved. They didn't have control over what they did with their lives, but they could rise to power in places where there was mobility. And in the Deccan at this time, there was a lot of mobility for them. And so we have portraits of many Habshis that were led the armies in the Deccan. So I'm showing you one from Ahmednagar and one from Golconda here. What makes Ikhlas Khan interesting, and an interesting figure for me, is not that he was more powerful than other Habshis. He was the prime minister, and many people think he was actually the power behind the throne. So this is Muhammad Adil Shah, and this is Ikhlas Khan, and you can see again another one over here. But what's interesting from an art historical perspective is we have more portraits of Ikhlas Khan than any of the other Habshis, and many of them seem to have been done by the same artist, Muhammad Khan. And so we think that he had his own sort of group of artists that worked for him, his own court. This portrait in particular, I wanted to focus on for a second, and it's just because it's such a sensitive portrait, and you can see here now by this point, portraiture is starting to pay attention to what they look like, and you can see his status through his very, very fine clothing and the fact that he's holding a document, right, to show his status. Okay, so far I focused on 4 men. So for my last figure, I would like to talk about a woman. And the woman I'd like to talk about is named Chand Bibi. And she was a queen in Bijapur. She was born in Ahmednagar. So she was born in Ahmednagar to the north. Her father was the king there. She was married to Ali Adil Shah who was the ruler before Ibrahim II. They didn't have any children, and I'm showing you a portrait of him here. They didn't have any children, but he died in 1580 when Ibrahim Adil Shah II was only 10 years old. So Chand Bibi becomes the regent for 10 years, ruling Bijapur when Ibrahim is too young. When he gets older, she goes back to Ahmednagar, back home, and we don't hear too much about her until 15, I'm just looking for the year here, because I know you're all very, very worried that I get the year right, 1595, when the Mughals attack Ahmednagar. So the Mughals attack Ahmednagar, and they breach the fortress walls. So I'm showing you Ahmednagar Fortress here, and they breach the walls. And at that moment, she goes to the breach in the wall and she shows herself in public and galvanizes the troops and leads the troop and defeats the Mughal armies and saves Ahmednagar. So she is remembered in history for this historic event for which she defended Ahmednagar. Now, before we get too romantic about it, the Mughals come back with a bigger army. She realizes they can't win. She negotiates a treaty. The nobles around her think she betrayed them, and they have her killed. So it doesn't end well for her. But what's interesting from an art historical perspective is that we don't have any paintings of her made during her lifetime. I think there were some made, and I'll tell you why, but we don't have any that survive. But in the late 18th century, in the late 17th, mid-18th century, she becomes this incredibly popular subject for painting. So here I'm showing you some paintings all made around like 1750. And she's always shown on horseback, sometimes hunting, mostly hawking, but she's never shown for the event for which she's most famous. These are later comic books. Some of you might recognize them. Nor is she ever shown inside in the harem like most women at the time were shown in paintings. She's always shown outside doing something active, but always proper. There's never men around her. The reason why so some of them are so similar that I do think that they were based on a painting of her that survived, that was made during her lifetime. And the reason I think that is twofold. One, there were paintings of her mother. So this painting over here is of her father, and originally, do you see that ghostly figure? That was her mother, and this is a history book of Ahmednagar, and she was next to her husband in every single picture. She was later erased, not because she was a woman, but because her son didn't like her very much. Thought she was too powerful. This same son, by the way, attacked Bijapur when Chand Bibi was regent. And she had to fight off her own brother from attacking Bijapur. So the guy sounds really great. So we know that there was a tradition. But the other thing is that the other figure who was popularly painted in the 18th century was Ibrahim Adil Shah II. And I'm showing you two 18th century pictures of him here. And here we have the original one. So do you see how they're clearly based on that? So, but in any case, I cannot prove that. But what's interesting is that there were so many paintings of her that were made at this time in the 18th century that when the British started to come, they all knew about Chand Bibi. And so much so that one historian, Meadows Taylor, actually penned a novel about her called A Noble Queen. And so she's an example of how art shapes how we remember history. She was remembered in early tellings of Deccan history because of all of these paintings that survived of her. So it's not just that history can inform how we talk about art, but art also can inform how we talk about history, right? When we think about it. And so I hope in this exploration that I've given you a taste of not just how cool and amazing Bijapur is, or was in the 16th and 17th centuries, but of the diversity that existed, that maybe goes beyond what we imagine when we talk about India. And I want you, so this is my encapsulating last slide, and I want you to think about this, that all of this diversity existed in one small sultanate in about a 150-year period. So if that much diversity existed in that case, imagine the diversity that exists when we talk about the entire Indian subcontinent and all 5,000 plus years of its art. And so surely it's worth paying some attention to. Thank you.